Professor Kethmiran dropped his presentation remote, and the sound echoed through the crystalline conference hall like a gunshot. For 17 years, he'd delivered this same lecture without incident. Today felt different. His audience, 139 of the galaxy's most distinguished researchers, sat in perfect concentric rings around the central platform. The bioluminescent walls of Research Station Omega pulsed with soft blues and greens, designed to promote intellectual clarity across multiple species. Beyond the transparent dome, a nebula swirled. In shades of gold and amber, carefully selected for its calming psychological effects. "My apologies," Kethmiri muttered, retrieving the device. His hands were shaking slightly, though he couldn't explain why. The presentation had gone flawlessly through its first 43 slides. The mathematical models were elegant, the theoretical frameworks were bulletproof, yet something felt wrong. He clicked to slide 44. Deathworld species, theoretical limitations. "As I was explaining," he continued, his voice regaining its usual academic authority, "Deathworld evolution represents nature's greatest failure. Any species unlucky enough to develop on a hostile planet becomes forever trapped by their adaptations." The holographic display showed a rotating model of atmospheric pressure variations, crushing gravity wells, radiation levels that would sterilize most known life forms, temperature fluctuations that spanned hundreds of degrees. "Consider the physiological requirements." Kethmiran gestured at bone density calculations. "To survive standard Deathworld conditions, a species would need skeletal structures approximately 3 times denser than our own. The metabolic cost alone would make interstellar travel impossible." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. Dr. Yexandra from the Rigel Institute nodded approvingly. Professor Morthland from Centauri Prime was taking detailed notes. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Furthermore, Kethmiran clicked to his next slide. The cardiovascular adaptations required for high-pressure environments would make survival in standard atmospheric conditions impossible. A Deathworld species attempting to live on a civilized planet would quite literally explode from internal pressure differential. This earned a few chuckles from the crowd. The image was absurd. Primitive creatures trying to function in sophisticated galactic society, their biology working against them at every turn. "The neurological requirements present even greater obstacles," he continued, warming to his subject. "Deathworld survival would demand reaction speeds and pain tolerance that would render the species psychologically incompatible with civilized interaction. They would be, by definition, savage and unpredictable." More nods of approval. The research was solid. Decades of theoretical modeling supported every conclusion. In summary, Kethmiran advanced to his final slide. "Deathworld species represent evolutionary blind alleys. They cannot achieve space travel, cannot survive outside their hostile environments, and certainly cannot participate in galactic civilization. They are, quite simply, impossible." The audience began preparing their applause. This was Kethmirian's signature moment, the triumphant conclusion to a presentation that had influenced policy across 17 star systems. The theoretical framework that kept dangerous worlds quarantined and galactic civilizations safe. Then someone raised their hand. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable in the back rows, but something about it made Kethmiran pause. The hand belonged to a figure he hadn't noticed before. Someone wearing simple researcher robes without any visible academic honors. They sat with perfect stillness, as if they'd been carved from stone. "Yes," Kethmiran called out, though his instincts were suddenly screaming at him to ignore the question and end the presentation. The figure stood slowly, average height, unremarkable build, but there was something about their posture that made several audience members turn to look. They moved with a kind of controlled precision that suggested either extensive military training or neurological optimization. "Professor Kethmiran," the voice was soft, conversational, and carried an accent that Kethmiran's linguistic processors couldn't identify. "I have a question about your atmospheric pressure calculations." "Of course," Kethmiran replied, though his mouth had gone dry for reasons he couldn't explain. "Please proceed." You mentioned that Deathworld species would require bone density approximately 3 times greater than standard galactic norms to survive crushing gravity. Could you elaborate on what you consider crushing gravity to be? It was a perfectly reasonable academic question. Kethmiran had fielded similar inquiries hundreds of times before. Yet something about the tone made his primary nervous system spike with alarm. Well, he began, consulting his notes. Anything above 1.2 standard gravities becomes progressively more difficult for evolved life to manage. Beyond 1.5 gravities, most species experience significant physiological stress. Beyond 2 gravities, long-term survival becomes questionable. I see, the questioner replied. And what about 3.7 gravities? The number hung in the air like a challenge. Kethmiran blinked in confusion. I'm sorry, what? 3.7 gravities. Specifically, what would you expect to happen to a standard galactic species if they were suddenly exposed to, say, 3.7 times normal gravitational pull? Several audience members shifted uncomfortably. The question seemed oddly specific. They would, Kethmiran paused, running calculations in his head. They would be crushed. Immediate skeletal failure. Cardiovascular collapse. Death. Within minutes. Possibly seconds. And what about 0.8 gravities? Now Kethmiran was genuinely confused. That would be more comfortable than standard conditions. Easier to move, less strain on the system. Most species would consider it quite pleasant. Excellent, the questioner said, still standing in the back row. So, if I told you that someone in this room has been living comfortably in 0.8 gravities for the past 3 days, what would you conclude? They're experiencing ideal conditions for their physiology, Kethmiran replied automatically. Then the implication hit him. Wait, are you suggesting that this station's artificial gravity is set below standard? Actually, the questioner's voice remained pleasantly conversational. I'm suggesting it's set above standard. For me, the conference hall had gone completely silent. Even the bioluminescent walls seemed to have dimmed. I don't understand, Kethmiran said, though part of him was beginning to understand all too well. The gravity on this station is currently set to 0.8 times what I'm used to at home, the figure explained calmly, which means my homeworld operates at approximately 3.7 times what you consider normal gravity. According to your research, that should make me impossible. Dr. Yexandro made a small choking sound. Professor Morthlin had gone very pale. Someone in the third row whispered what sounded like a prayer in ancient Centaurian. Furthermore, the questioner continued, I noticed that your atmospheric composition data is quite interesting. You mentioned that Deathworld species would need to be adapted to toxic gas concentrations. Could you define toxic in this context? Kethmir's presentation remote clattered to the floor again. This time, he didn't bother to pick it up. He began, then stopped. His throat felt tight. Who are you? The figure in the back row smiled. It wasn't a threatening expression, but somehow it was more terrifying than any snarl or battle cry. I'm Dr. Reese Blackwood, they said, visiting researcher from the Sol 3 Educational Exchange Program. I've been attending your symposium for the past 3 days, and I have to say, your theoretical framework is fascinating. The temperature in the conference hall seemed to drop by several degrees. Sol 3, Dr. Yexandro whispered. That's in the galactic database as a Class 12 Deathworld, Dr. Blackwood confirmed cheerfully. Completely uninhabitable according to standard classifications. Atmosphere that would kill most species within hours. Gravity that would crush your bones. Radiation levels that would cook your cellular structure. They paused, looking around the room with the same pleasant expression. Or, as we call it, home. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the comfortable quiet of an engaged academic audience, but the suffocating stillness that comes after someone has just shattered your understanding of reality. Professor Kethmiran realized, with growing horror, that he had just spent 17 years teaching theories about Deathworld species to one of their actual representatives, and they had been taking notes. The implications crashed over him in waves. Every slide he'd presented, every mathematical model proving Deathworld species were evolutionary dead ends, every confident assertion about their limitations, all delivered to someone who was living proof that his life's work was catastrophically wrong. Kethmiran began, then found himself completely unable to continue. His vocal cords seemed to have forgotten how to function. Dr. Blackwood remained standing, still wearing that pleasant smile that was becoming more unnerving by the second. Please, don't let me interrupt. I'm quite eager to hear the rest of your presentation, particularly the section about neurological adaptation. The audience had gone beyond silence into what could only be described as collective psychological suspension. Dr. Yexandra was gripping her chair arms so tightly that stress fractures had appeared in the reinforced polymer. Professor Mortlin had activated some kind of personal recording device, though whether for academic documentation or evidence preservation wasn't clear. In the administrative booth overlooking the conference hall, Station Director Qualmoth was frantically reviewing the attendee registration database. His 6 eyes scanned through entry records with increasing desperation, looking for any mention of Sol 3 or Deathworld designations. The system showed Dr. Blackwood's credentials as perfectly legitimate: visiting researcher status, proper academic references, even a small notation about atmospheric accommodation requests that had been routinely approved by automated systems. How did we miss this? Kalamoth whispered to his assistant, a nervous Alterian whose blue skin had gone completely pale. Our security protocols specifically screen for dangerous species classifications. Sir, the assistant replied, her voice barely audible. Sol 3 isn't listed as dangerous. It's listed as uninhabitable. The system categorized Dr. Blackwood as a theoretical impossibility. The algorithms assumed. The registration was a clerical error. Back in the conference hall, Dr. Blackwood had begun walking slowly down the aisle toward the central platform. Their movement was fluid, controlled, but there was something about their gait that suggested enormous power held in careful check. Several audience members instinctively leaned away as they passed. You mentioned earlier, Dr. Blackwood said conversationally, that Deathworld species would require reaction speeds incompatible with civilized interaction. I'm curious about your definition of incompatible. They paused next to a holographic display showing standard galactic neural response times. The chart indicated that most civilized species processed information and reacted to stimuli within 0.3 to 0.8 seconds, depending on complexity. His measurements, Dr. Blackwood continued, gesturing at the data, represent the baseline for safe social interaction, correct? Anything faster would be problematic? Yes, Kethmir managed to croak. Faster reaction times would indicate a species adapted for constant threat assessment. Such beings would be hypervigilant, aggressive, unsuitable for diplomatic contact. I see. Dr. Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. And what would you say about someone whose baseline reaction time is approximately 0.05 seconds? The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Several biologists in the audience began calculating the implications. A reaction time that fast would mean a nervous system operating at roughly 15 times normal efficiency. It would suggest a species that had evolved in an environment where split-sec responses meant the difference between life and death. That would be... Kethmiran's voice failed him entirely. Impossible? Dr. Blackwood suggested helpfully. According to your models, someone with that kind of neurological development should be essentially feral. Unable to engage in complex reasoning, incapable of academic discourse, certainly not suited for attending theoretical symposiums. They had reached the central platform now, standing just a few meters from Kethmiran. Up close, the professor could see details that had been invisible from the podium. Dr. Blackwood's muscle definition was subtle, but clearly present beneath their research robes. Their postures suggested someone who could move from academic conversation to physical action with terrifying efficiency. Most unsettling, their eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning, assessing, cataloging potential threats and escape routes with the unconscious competence of an apex predator. The interesting thing about your atmospheric composition research, Dr. Blackwood continued, apparently oblivious to the mounting panic around them, is how it assumes that toxic gases are universally harmful. For instance, your charts show that oxygen concentrations above 19% become dangerous, while anything below 16% is classified as unbreathable. They gestured toward the environmental readouts displayed on the conference hall's walls. This station is currently maintaining atmosphere at 18.2% oxygen, 79.1% nitrogen, with trace gases making up the remainder. Perfect for most galactic species. Yes, Kethmiran whispered, though he suspected he didn't want to hear where this was leading. On my homeworld, Dr. Blackwood said with that same pleasant tone, oxygen concentrations hover around 21%, which means I've been operating in a slightly oxygen-depleted environment for the past 3 days. Nothing serious, mind you, roughly equivalent to being at moderate altitude. But it does explain why I've been feeling a bit sluggish during the morning sessions. Dr. Yexandra made a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at speech. Furthermore, Dr. Blackwood continued, your research indicates that atmospheric pressure variations of more than 10% from galactic standard would cause severe physiological distress. Yet I've been quite comfortable at this station's 0.847 standard atmospheres. Which raises interesting questions about adaptation thresholds. Professor Mortland was now openly recording the conversation, his trembling hands holding a personal data recorder. The academic implications were staggering. If even half of what Dr. Blackwood was saying was true, it would require fundamental revisions to decades of established xenobiological theory. Dr. Blackwood, Kethmiran finally managed to say, if your species possesses these capabilities, why haven't we encountered them before? Why is Sol 3 classified as uninhabitable? The human smile grew slightly wider. Oh, but you have encountered us. Several times, actually. It's just that your theoretical framework classified those encounters as impossible, so they were filed under unexplained phenomena or instrumentation error. They pulled out a simple data pad, primitive by galactic standards but functional. I've been documenting some fascinating discrepancies between your theories and observed reality. For instance, there are 16 recorded cases of impossible atmospheric readings from Sol 3 system exploration probes. 12 incidents of gravitational anomalies that suggested higher planetary density than your models predicted, and 23 reports of equipment malfunction when automated systems detected biosignatures that shouldn't exist on a Deathworld. The conference hall had achieved a level of silence that seemed to absorb sound itself. Even the station's environmental systems seemed to be holding their breath. But perhaps most interesting, Dr. Blackwood concluded, are the 7 official first contact reports that were dismissed as obvious fabrications because they described encounters with beings from uninhabitable worlds. Apparently, my people have been trying to establish diplomatic contact for quite some time. It's just that your theoretical framework kept explaining us away. Station Director Qualmoth's voice crackled over the conference hall's communication system, barely controlled panic evident in every word. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished colleagues, we're implementing emergency protocols. Please remain calm while we assess the situation. Dr. Blackwood looked up toward the administrative booth with what appeared to be genuine concern. I do hope I haven't caused any problems. I really was just attending as an observer. Though I have to admit your theoretical framework raises some fascinating questions about how galactic civilization defines impossible. The word echoed through the conference hall with ominous finality. Professor Kethmiran stared at the human standing calmly beside his ruined presentation and realized that the galaxy was about to learn some very uncomfortable truths about what was actually possible. Station Director Qualmoth burst through the administrative booth's blast doors like a creature fleeing from a supernova. His 6 eyes were dilated with stress hormones, and his breathing apparatus was cycling at emergency rates. Behind him, a stream of panicked officials flooded into the conference hall's upper observation deck. Emergency lockdown protocols, Qualmoth shouted into his communicator. Seal all docking bays. No ships leave this station until we figure out what we're dealing with. Chief Security Officer Vextalon, a imposing Centaurian whose exoskeleton was designed for handling dangerous situations, activated her personal shields and began coordinating evacuation procedures. Sir, we have 139 civilians in potential danger. Recommend immediate containment and species-specific medical standby. Containment of what? Dr. Blackwood called up to the booth, their voice carrying easily across the conference hall without apparent effort. I'm just here for the symposium. I even brought my own atmospheric supplement dispenser in case the station's environment proved incompatible. They held up a small device that looked suspiciously like standard emergency breathing apparatus, except it was clearly designed for someone accustomed to much higher atmospheric pressure and oxygen concentration. Dr. Yexandra finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a strangled whisper. "You've been supplementing the atmosphere?" "Just a bit," Dr. Blackwood replied cheerfully. "Nothing dramatic. Your standard mix is perfectly breathable, just a little thin for extended intellectual activity. Think of it like, well, like how you might need caffeine to stay alert in a low-stimulation environment." The comparison sent ripples of unease through the audience. The idea that this station's carefully calibrated atmosphere was low stimulation for anyone was deeply disturbing. Professor Morthland was frantically accessing the galactic species database through his personal interface, searching for any information about Sol 3 inhabitants. What he found made his primary cardiac organs skip several beats. "Director Qualmoth," he called out, his voice cracking with strain. "I'm reading the official classification records for Sol 3. The planet is listed as Class 12 Deathworld, Extreme Hazard Designation, with a diplomatic contact prohibition dating back 432 standard years." "What kind of prohibition?" Kalmuth demanded. "Complete species quarantine, no contact authorized under any circumstances. The notation says," Morthland paused, double-checking the data. "The notation says, potential galactic security threat due to unpredictable adaptation capabilities and excessive survival optimization." A collective intake of breath echoed through the conference hall. Everyone turned to look at Dr. Blackwood, who seemed genuinely surprised by this information. "Excessive survival optimization?" they repeated, sounding almost offended. "That seems a bit harsh. We prefer to think of it as being prepared for contingencies." Chief Vextullen's tactical analysis systems were running continuous threat assessments, and the results were making her nervous system spike with alarm signals. The human's biometric readings were unlike anything in her database. Bone density readings that should have made movement impossible. Muscle fiber composition that suggested capabilities far beyond standard galactic norms. Most disturbing, their nervous system appeared to be operating at approximately 20 times normal efficiency. "Dr. Blackwood," Vextallen called down from the security station. "I need to ask you to remain perfectly still while we assess the situation." "Of course," Dr. Blackwood replied, immediately freezing in place with the kind of absolute stillness that suggested either extensive military training or predator-level body control. Though I should mention that perfectly still is a relative concept. My baseline metabolic rate requires what you might consider constant micro-movement to maintain optimal circulation. Even as they spoke, Vextalon's sensors detected minute muscular adjustments that most species would require conscious effort to achieve. The human's body was apparently optimizing itself automatically for current conditions. "Furthermore," Dr. Blackwood continued conversationally, "I should probably mention that your security scans are quite thorough. I can actually feel the electromagnetic pulses from your threat assessment equipment. It's rather like having someone tap you gently with a metal rod every few seconds." Vextalon checked her scanner settings. The electromagnetic output was well below the detection threshold for any known species. The fact that the human could sense subsonic electromagnetic patterns suggested sensory capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. "Dr. Blackwood," Professor Kethmiran said, his voice steadier now that he'd moved past the initial shock into professional crisis management mode. "Perhaps you could help us understand what we're dealing with. What exactly are the capabilities of your species?" "That's an excellent question," Dr. Blackwood replied with evident enthusiasm. "And since this is an academic conference focused on theoretical Deathworld biology, I'd be happy to provide some practical data points for your research." They paused, looking around the conference hall with the same pleasant expression that was somehow becoming more ominous with each interaction. "In fact, if Dr. Kethmiran wouldn't mind, I'd like to request permission to give a brief demonstration. Nothing dramatic, just some basic examples of what you call excessive survival optimization in action." The temperature in the conference hall seemed to drop by several degrees. Station Director Qualmoth felt his breathing apparatus constrict with automatic stress responses. "Demonstration," he managed to ask. "Physical capabilities, sensory adaptations, that sort of thing?" Dr. Blackwood explained. I think it would be quite educational. After all, theoretical models are useful, but empirical evidence is so much more convincing. Chief Vextalon was already reaching for her emergency containment protocols. Sir, I strongly advise against any demonstration of Deathworld capabilities in a civilian environment. Oh, I completely understand the concern, Dr. Blackwood said with genuine appreciation. Safety is paramount, but I was thinking more along the lines of basic physiological demonstrations, environmental adaptation, sensory acuity, that sort of thing. Nothing that would require weapons or potentially dangerous equipment. They gestured toward the conference hall's various environmental controls and testing equipment. For instance, this hall has adjustable gravity generators, atmospheric composition controls, and what appears to be a rather sophisticated holographic projection system. We could easily create controlled experimental conditions for observing Deathworld adaptations without any risk to the audience. Professor Morthland found himself genuinely intrigued despite his terror. What kind of adaptations are we talking about? Well, Dr. Blackwood began, their eyes lighting up with academic enthusiasm. There's gravitational tolerance, atmospheric flexibility, sensory range optimization, physical stress responses, and what we call environmental threat assessment protocols. Each item on the list sounded progressively more alarming. I should mention, Dr. Blackwood added, that these demonstrations would provide invaluable data for correcting the theoretical framework we've been discussing. Think of it as peer review in real time. Station Director Qualmoth found himself in an impossible position. As a research facility director, he was trained to pursue scientific knowledge regardless of personal risk. As a station commander, he was responsible for the safety of everyone aboard. As a rational being, he was terrified of what a Deathworld species might consider a basic demonstration. Dr. Blackwood, he said carefully, what exactly would these demonstrations involve? Nothing extreme, Dr. Blackwood assured him. Perhaps a brief adjustment to local gravity to show adaptation responses, some atmospheric composition changes to demonstrate respiratory flexibility, maybe a few sensory acuity tests using your holographic systems. They paused, looking thoughtful. Oh, and if you have any emergency scenarios in your safety protocols, we could test threat response capabilities, just to show how Deathworld species handle unexpected situations. The phrase, emergency scenarios, sent waves of alarm through the security staff. Absolutely not, Chief Vextalon stated firmly. No emergency simulations with an unknown species present. Unknown species? Dr. Blackwood repeated, sounding hurt. I prefer inadequately documented, and I really think these demonstrations would be quite safe. After all, what's the worst that could happen with a single unarmed researcher in a controlled environment? The question hung in the air with ominous implications. Professor Kethmiran realized he was facing a choice between scientific curiosity and personal survival. His academic training demanded that he pursue knowledge. His survival instincts were screaming at him to evacuate the station immediately. The worst that could happen, he heard himself saying, is that we learn something that fundamentally changes our understanding of what's possible in this galaxy. Station Director Qualmoth stared down at the human who was calmly requesting permission to demonstrate capabilities that violated several galactic treaties simply by existing. Against all common sense and probably several regulations, he found himself saying, I'm authorizing a limited demonstration under strict safety protocols. Chief Vextalon made a sound that might have been a prayer in ancient Centaurian. Dr. Blackwood smiled with genuine delight. Excellent. This should be quite educational for everyone involved. Dr. Blackwood walked to the center of the conference hall with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation they couldn't handle. The gravitational field generators hummed to life as Station Director Kalamuth reluctantly authorized access to the hall's environmental controls. Let's start with something simple, Dr. Blackwood announced to the increasingly nervous audience. Professor Kethmiran mentioned that Deathworld species would require bone density approximately 3 times greater than galactic standard. I thought we might test that hypothesis. The gravity readings on the conference hall's displays showed the current setting, 0.8 standard gravities, which Dr. Blackwood had described as low for their comfort. Chief Vextalon monitored the controls with her finger hovering over the emergency shutdown. Current gravity feels quite pleasant, Dr. Blackwood commented, performing a casual stretch that demonstrated remarkable flexibility. Almost like floating. Shall we try something more substantial? The gravity increased to 1 standard. Dr. Blackwood's posture didn't change at all. 1.5 gravities. Still no visible effect. 2 gravities. Dr. Blackwood continued speaking conversationally, while Professor Morthland began calculating the force load on human skeletal structure. This is approximately what most of you would experience as crushing pressure, Dr. Blackwood explained, their voice completely unaffected by what should have been debilitating gravitational stress. For reference, most galactic species would be experiencing significant difficulty breathing and severe joint strain at this level. Dr. Yexandra was taking frantic readings on her portable scanner. The human's bone density measurements were registering at impossible levels. Their skeletal structure appeared to be approximately 4.3 times denser than anything in the galactic biological database. B gravities. The audience was watching in fascinated horror as Dr. Blackwood began performing what appeared to be casual exercises. At this level, they continued, most species would be experiencing cardiovascular failure. The human circulatory system, however, is designed for variable pressure environments. Dr. Blackwood executed a perfect somersault, landing with fluid grace that should have been impossible under triple gravitational load, 3.7 gravities. The gravity level they had mentioned as their homeworld standard. Much better, Dr. Blackwood said with obvious relief. This feels more like home. Would anyone like to see what we consider normal physical activity? Without waiting for a response, they began demonstrating what they called basic movement patterns, running at speeds that blurred their form, jumping to heights that defied gravitational mathematics. Most disturbing of all, they moved with the same casual grace they had shown at lower gravity levels. The interesting thing about Deathworld evolution, Dr. Blackwood explained while performing what appeared to be combat maneuvers against invisible opponents, is that it optimizes for worst-case scenarios. This means we're typically operating at a fraction of our actual capabilities in normal environments. Professor Kethmiran was watching his life's work crumble in real time. Every assumption about physical limitations was being systematically demolished by a single individual who was treating physics-defying capabilities as mundane reality. Dr. Blackwood, he managed to call out, what would you consider maximum physical exertion? The human paused, considering the question with academic seriousness. Well, we probably shouldn't test that in a civilian environment, but I suppose we could try, let's say, 5.2 gravities? That's roughly what we experienced during severe weather events on Sol 3. The gravity generators strained to accommodate the request. At 5.2 gravities, the station's structural integrity warnings began flashing amber alerts. Dr. Blackwood, meanwhile, continued their demonstration with what appeared to be increased enthusiasm. Perfect, they announced, beginning a series of movements that could only be described as controlled violence. This is much more like the conditions I trained in. Half the audience had begun quietly edging toward the exits. Now then, Dr. Blackwood said, apparently satisfied with the gravity demonstration. Shall we move on to atmospheric adaptation? Chief Vextalon was monitoring environmental systems with growing alarm. Dr. Blackwood, please return gravity to standard levels before we proceed with atmospheric tests. Of course, Dr. Blackwood replied, though they seemed reluctant to give up the higher gravity. Though I should mention that atmospheric testing might be more interesting than you expect. The gravity gradually decreased back to station standard. Dr. Blackwood's movement immediately became more controlled, as if they were consciously compensating for the reduced environmental resistance. Professor Kethmiran mentioned that Deathworld atmospheres would be toxic to most species, Dr. Blackwood began, accessing the environmental controls with disturbing familiarity. I think you'll find that toxic is somewhat relative. The atmospheric composition displays showed current levels, 18.2% oxygen, 79.1% nitrogen, with trace gases making up the remainder. All areas of the ship are This is quite breathable, Dr. Blackwood acknowledged, though a bit low in oxygen for sustained intellectual activity. My homeworld typically runs about 21% oxygen, which I understand is considered dangerously high by galactic standards. They began adjusting the atmospheric mixture. Oxygen levels crept upward, 19%, 20%, 21%. Much better, Dr. Blackwood said, taking a deep breath. Though we should probably test some of the other atmospheric components that my world considers normal. Dr. Yexandra was frantically checking the atmospheric safety protocols. Dr. Blackwood, what other components are you referring to? Oh, the usual trace gases, Dr. Blackwood replied casually. Sulfur compounds, various industrial pollutants, elevated carbon dioxide levels, that sort of thing. Nothing dramatic. They continued adjusting the environmental controls while talking. Sol 3's atmosphere contains approximately 0.04% carbon dioxide, along with various compounds that would be classified as industrial toxins on most worlds. We also have significantly higher atmospheric pressure and more diverse particulate matter. The station's environmental warnings began displaying increasingly urgent alerts as Dr. Blackwood continued their adjustments. For example, they said, introducing trace amounts of compounds that made the station's air filtration systems activate emergency protocols. What you call pollution, we consider normal background atmosphere. Our cities regularly experience air quality that would require evacuation protocols on other worlds. Professor Morthland was watching the atmospheric readings with scientific fascination and personal terror. The human was casually introducing chemical concentrations that should have required hazmat protocols. Dr. Blackwood, Station Director Qualmoth called down urgently. Those chemical levels are approaching our emergency evacuation threshold. Really? Dr. Blackwood seemed genuinely surprised. These are just trace amounts. Though, I suppose different species have different tolerance levels. They paused the atmospheric adjustments, looking thoughtful. Actually, this raises an interesting point about what we consider relaxing environmental conditions. Perhaps I should explain some of our recreational preferences. The shift in topic somehow made the atmosphere in the conference hall feel more ominous, despite the return to normal air composition. Human recreational activities, Dr. Blackwood began with obvious enthusiasm, are designed around what we call controlled stress optimization. We actively seek experiences that would be classified as emergency situations by most species. They activated the hall's holographic display system, showing images that made several audience members immediately start backing toward the exits. For instance, we enjoy something called mountain climbing, which involves deliberately placing ourselves in high-altitude, low-oxygen environments with significant fall hazards. The goal is to reach locations where atmospheric pressure and temperature conditions would kill most galactic species. The holographic displays showed humans scaling vertical rock faces in conditions that looked suspiciously like the surface of airless moons. We also practice deep-sea diving, which involves descending to ocean depths where pressure levels would crush most known life forms. We consider this relaxing. More images. Humans swimming at depths where the pressure readings made the station's engineers check their instruments twice. Combat sports are quite popular as well, Dr. Blackwood continued cheerfully. We deliberately engage in physical contests designed to cause controlled injury. Boxing, martial arts, wrestling, activities where the primary objective is to physically dominate another human through applied violence. The holographic displays now showed humans engaged in what could only be described as ritualized warfare for entertainment purposes. But perhaps our most telling recreational preference, Dr. Blackwood said with growing academic excitement, is what we call extreme sports. These are activities specifically designed to trigger our survival response systems for entertainment value. Images of humans jumping from aircraft, navigating white heater rapids, and racing vehicles at lethal speeds filled the holographic display. We actively seek situations that combine multiple life-threatening factors: high speed, significant altitude, environmental hazards, equipment failure potential. The more dangerous the activity, the more enjoyable we find it. Dr. Yexander whispered what sounded like a prayer in ancient Rigelian. The fascinating thing, Dr. Blackwood continued, is that these activities are so popular on Sol 3 that we've developed entire industries around providing controlled near-death experiences. We literally pay for the privilege of being terrified. The conference hall had achieved a level of silence that seemed to absorb sound itself. But the most important thing to understand about human psychology, Dr. Blackwood concluded with a smile that had lost all pretense of pleasantness, is that all of these activities we consider relaxing, entertaining, and enjoyable represent the kinds of situations we use to unwind after dealing with actual stress. The implications of that statement settled over the audience like a physical weight. Station Director Qualmuth realized that they had just learned what one of the galaxy's apex predator species did for fun, and it was terrifying. Dr. Blackwood seemed to notice the growing unease in their audience and made what appeared to be an attempt at reassurance. "I should clarify that these are voluntary recreational activities," they said with academic precision. "Humans don't require external motivation to engage in life-threatening situations. We actively seek them out for psychological satisfaction." This clarification somehow made things worse. Professor Morthlen was frantically updating his notes, trying to document the systematic demolition of established xenobiological theory. "Dr. Blackwood, you mentioned that these activities help you unwind after dealing with actual stress. Could you elaborate on what constitutes genuine stress for your species?" The human's expression grew thoughtful, as if considering how to explain something complex to a child. "Well, actual stress would involve situations where multiple survival systems are engaged simultaneously. Environmental hazards combined with resource scarcity, territorial disputes with competing apex predators, large-scale atmospheric or geological events, that sort of thing." They paused, apparently searching for appropriate examples. "For instance, what we call natural disasters would represent moderate stress scenarios. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, severe weather systems, tsunamis. These require active survival management rather than recreational engagement." The holographic display shifted to show images that made the station's emergency response team reach for their containment protocols. Massive geological upheavals. Atmospheric disturbances that would sterilize most planets. Weather patterns that looked like military bombardments. Humans consider these manageable challenges rather than extinction-level events, Dr. Blackwood explained conversationally. "We've developed entire civilizations in regions that experience regular seismic activity, volcanic activity, and severe weather patterns." Chief Vextall was running continuous threat assessments on the implications of what she was hearing. A species that considered natural disasters moderate stress would require survival capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. "But the most significant stress factors," Dr. Blackwood continued, "involve resource competition with other apex predators. Sol 3 hosts multiple species capable of challenging human territorial dominance." The holographic display now showed Earth's wildlife, and the audience began to understand why Sol 3 was classified as a Deathworld. Massive predators with crushing bite forces. Venomous creatures that could kill most galactic species with casual contact. Territorial competitors that weighed several tons and possessed natural weapons that looked like military equipment. "We share our homeworld with creatures that most galactic species would classify as bioweapons," Dr. Blackwood said with obvious affection. "Large carnivores, toxic reptiles, aggressive marine predators, territorial mammals with natural armor plating. Humans have learned to coexist with species that could eliminate most civilized populations." Dr. Yxandra was calculating the implications with growing horror. "Dr. Blackwood, how does your species maintain territorial control against multiple apex predator competitors?" The human's smile returned, and it was not reassuring. "We don't maintain territorial control against them," Dr. Blackwood replied. "We maintain territorial control over them. Most of Sol 3's apex predators now exist in numbers and locations determined by human resource management decisions." The phrase resource management carried ominous implications when applied to apex predator populations. "But perhaps more relevant to this symposium," Dr. Blackwood continued, "is how we handle actual existential threats. Situations where human survival is genuinely at risk." The conference hall had achieved a level of attention that bordered on hypnotic fascination. Everyone present understood they were about to learn something that would fundamentally change their understanding of galactic power dynamics. Genuine existential threats require what we call coordinated species response protocols, Dr. Blackwood explained with the same academic tone they'd maintained throughout their presentation. "These involve temporarily suspending individual survival preferences in favor of collective species optimization, They gestured toward the holographic display, which now showed images that looked suspiciously like military infrastructure. For example, when humans encounter potential threats to our species' long-term survival, we activate resource allocation systems that can convert our entire civilization's productive capacity into threat elimination capabilities within a matter of months. Professor Kethmiran felt his understanding of galactic security dynamics beginning to collapse. Dr. Blackwood, what kind of threat elimination capabilities are we discussing? Oh, the usual options, Dr. Blackwood replied with terrifying casualness. Environmental modification, resource denial, biological adaptation, technological acceleration. We tend to approach existential threats as engineering problems rather than military conflicts. The implications of treating planetary extinction as an engineering problem sent waves of alarm through the station's command staff. The interesting thing about human threat response, Dr. Blackwood continued, is that we don't actually enjoy existential conflicts the way we enjoy recreational stress activities. When humans stop having fun, the situation has become genuinely serious. Station Director Qualmoth received an urgent priority message from the Galactic Security Council. Request immediate detailed report on human threat assessment capabilities. Council emergency session authorized. Recommend extreme caution in all interactions. Dr. Blackwood noticed the message indicators flashing throughout the conference hall's administrative systems. I do hope I'm not causing any diplomatic complications, they said with what appeared to be genuine concern. I really was just trying to provide some practical context for your theoretical framework. The fact that they could casually observe secure communication systems while maintaining academic conversation suggested sensory capabilities that extended far beyond normal parameters. Professor Kethmiran stared at the human who had just systematically demolished every assumption about Deathworld limitations, and realized that the galaxy was about to discover what happened when theoretical impossibilities turned out to be documented reality. The silence in the conference hall had evolved beyond mere quiet into something that approached a physical phenomenon. 139 of the galaxy's most distinguished researchers sat frozen in their seats, processing the systematic demolition of everything they thought they knew about biological limitations. Dr. Blackwood stood calmly in the center of the hall, apparently unaware that they had just redefined the parameters of galactic civilization's understanding of what constituted an apex predator species. Professor Kethmiran found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Dr. Blackwood, you've described human recreational activities, environmental management, and resource allocation protocols. But I have to ask, what do humans actually do when you encounter something that represents a genuine threat to your species? The question hung in the air like a challenge to the fundamental laws of physics. Dr. Blackwood's expression grew thoughtful, as if they were considering how to explain something obvious to someone who lacked the conceptual framework to understand it. That's an excellent question, Professor, they replied with academic appreciation. The answer depends on what kind of threat we're discussing. But generally speaking, humans approach threats using what we call the three-category response protocol. They gestured toward the holographic display, which activated to show a simple classification system. When humans encounter something potentially threatening, we immediately begin assessment for categorization. Everything in the universe falls into one of three categories: things that can be converted into food, things that can be converted into pets, and things that can be converted into weapons. The simplicity of the statement was somehow more terrifying than any complex military doctrine. Food category includes obvious biological resources, but also extends to energy sources, mineral compounds, and environmental elements that can be processed into usable materials. We're quite adaptable in terms of nutritional extraction. Dr. Yxandra was taking frantic notes, though her hands were shaking too badly to produce legible text. Pet category includes any entity that demonstrates useful capabilities but can be psychologically or biologically modified to serve human interests. This category has proven remarkably expansive over our evolutionary history. The holographic display showed images that made several audience members quietly excuse themselves from the conference hall. Massive predators sitting obediently beside human children. Creatures that looked like they belonged in military applications being used for transportation and companionship. Weapon category, Dr. Blackwood continued with the same pleasant academic tone, includes anything that resists categorization as food or pets. These entities are analyzed for tactical applications, then modified or deployed as force multiplication resources. Chief Vextalon's threat assessment systems were processing the implications and producing results that her training had never prepared her to handle. A species that automatically categorized everything as potential resources, allies, or weapons would approach galactic civilization itself as a classification problem. Dr. Blackwood, Station Director Qualmuth called down from the administrative booth, his voice carefully controlled. What category would other sapient species fall into? The human's smile returned, and it was the most terrifying expression anyone in the conference hall had ever witnessed. They depend entirely on how those species choose to interact with humanity, Dr. Blackwood replied. We strongly prefer the pet category for sapient species. It's much more enjoyable for everyone involved. The phrase, pet category for sapient species, sent ripples of absolute horror through the assembled researchers. But I should clarify, Dr. Blackwood added quickly, apparently noticing the growing panic, that human-pet relationships are based on mutual affection and benefit. We take excellent care of our pets. They live longer, healthier, happier lives under human management than they would in wild conditions. This clarification somehow made things infinitely worse. Professor Morthland raised a trembling hand. Dr. Blackwood, what determines whether a sapient species is classified as pets versus the other categories? Cooperation, Dr. Blackwood replied immediately. Species that demonstrate willingness to engage in positive-sum relationships with humanity are automatically categorized as pets. We become deeply emotionally invested in their welfare and will defend them against any threats with the same intensity we apply to protecting our own offspring. They paused, looking around the conference hall with genuine warmth. Species that refuse cooperation but don't actively threaten human interests are generally categorized as food. We incorporate their useful technologies, territories, and resources into human civilization through various acquisition methods. The casual mention of acquisition methods for non-cooperative species sent waves of alarm through the station's security systems. And species that actively threaten humanity, Dr. Blackwood concluded with academic precision, are categorized as weapons. We study their capabilities, adapt their useful characteristics, and deploy modified versions against future threats. The implications settled over the audience like a gravitational field. Station Director Qualmuth received another priority message, this one from the Galactic Council's Emergency Crisis Management Division. Immediate species reclassification authorized. Humans moved from theoretical impossibility to diplomatic priority alpha. All member species advised to implement friendly contact protocols immediately. Dr. Blackwood noticed the message traffic increasing throughout the station's communication systems. I do hope this information proves useful for your research, they said with obvious satisfaction. It's quite refreshing to discuss these topics with fellow academics. Most of our previous contact attempts were misclassified as equipment malfunctions or impossible readings. The systematic revelation that humanity had been trying to establish diplomatic contact for years, only to be dismissed as theoretical impossibilities, added another layer of horror to the situation. Within hours of Dr. Blackwood's presentation, the Galactic Science Council had convened an emergency session that resulted in the most comprehensive species reclassification in recorded history. Humans were removed from the theoretical impossibility category and immediately elevated to diplomatic emergency status, with a secondary classification of potential galactic security factor. Emergency protocols were distributed to every member species, outlining new interaction guidelines that emphasized cooperation, mutual benefit, and under no circumstances should humanity be threatened or provoked. The protocols included detailed instructions for ensuring that any contact with human representatives resulted in positive emotional associations. Most significantly, the Galactic Council authorized immediate establishment of formal diplomatic relations with Sol 3, along with comprehensive cultural exchange programs designed to ensure that humanity would categorize galactic civilization as pets rather than exploring the alternatives. 6 months later, Professor Kethmiran stood before a very different kind of classroom. His new course, Practical Deathworld Diplomacy, was taught in a reinforced facility with multiple emergency exits and a direct communication link to the Galactic Crisis Management Center. Today, class, we discuss the critical importance of maintaining positive relationships with apex predator civilizations, he began, consulting notes that had been reviewed by 17 different diplomatic security agencies. His students carefully selected representatives from major galactic powers, listened with the intense attention of beings whose species' survival might depend on proper protocol implementation. Remember, Kithmiran continued, humans categorize everything they encounter as food, pets, or weapons. Our entire diplomatic strategy must be focused on ensuring we remain firmly in the pet category through consistent demonstration of cooperation and mutual benefit. In the back of the classroom, Dr. Reese Blackwood sat quietly taking notes, having been appointed as the Galactic Council's chief cultural consultant for human relations. Their presence served multiple purposes: ensuring accuracy in the diplomatic education curriculum, providing real-time cultural guidance, and reminding everyone present of what was at stake. The appointment had been unanimous. When dealing with a species that viewed the universe as a collection of resources, allies, and weapons, it was crucial to maintain the kind of positive relationship that kept galactic civilizations safely in the ally category. Dr. Blackwood had accepted the position with characteristic enthusiasm, mentioning that they found the work quite relaxing compared to the stress levels of their previous research environment. The fact that serving as humanity's representative to galactic civilization was considered a low-stress assignment had not been lost on the Council's Strategic Assessment Division. Outside the classroom windows, the galaxy continued its normal functions, but with a new understanding of what was possible when evolution optimized for survival rather than comfort. Research Station Omega had become the center of a new field of study: how to maintain peaceful coexistence with species that considered extinction-level scenarios as engineering problems. The theoretical framework that had once dismissed Deathworld species as impossible had been replaced with practical protocols for ensuring they remained friendly. After all, when dealing with apex predators, the only safe relationship was one based on mutual affection and respect, and nobody wanted to find out what the alternatives looked like.